Hello everyone, I'm delighted to be joining you today, really to congratulate David on the publication of his book. Of course, David has been a stalwart of Westminster. He has been around for a long time, but of course he's got a great deal of experience, insight and knowledge. He's of course a fellow Essex MP and a great Essex MP. So David, I look forward to receiving my copy of your book, and of course I wish you every success.
Welcome everyone. My name is Pat Brown. I'm a Catholic priest and parish priest in Pimlico in central London. I'm a canon of Westminster Cathedral, and I'm the Roman Catholic duty priest for Parliament. I've known David Amess for 38 years. 1983 was the year he was elected to Parliament, but it was also the year he got married. And I was a priest at Westminster Cathedral at the time. So he approached me and we prepared his wedding there. And he and Julia, I officiated at the wedding. After that, the next coming together for us was in 1988, when I had the great privilege of taking Mother Teresa of Calcutta to see Margaret Thatcher in Downing Street. So we stopped off on the way in Parliament, and three very young MPs met us there. David Amess, David Alton, and the late Ken Hargreaves. These were young, very active Catholic MPs in Parliament and very much part of the pro-life movement there. They took us down to see the chapel and we prayed the rosary, and of course it was prayed so beautifully and slowly that I had to tap Mother Teresa. Imagine tapping a saint on the shoulder to say, we have to stop there because we're due across the road in Downing Street in a few minutes. But she was very gracious and we went across. David Amess, as I said, he has been very much a pro-life, a member of Parliament. That just doesn't mean being anti-abortion or anti-euthanasia. It means everything in between as well. So he's well known for his championing the animal rights, and Pope Francis in his recent book talks about all of us Christians, we need to have an integral ecology. So that means looking after life in all its forms, looking after the environment we live in, looking after the climate. That's what it means to be pro-life. And I think David is a good champion of all of that. In a few moments, you're going to meet his two pals, David Alton, Lord Alton now, and Anne Widdecombe. I never dreamed when I married David or officiated at his marriage that I would be introducing a knight of the realm, a peer of the realm, and a very famous superstar and ex-government minister as Anne is. But they are all very close friends, and I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting time listening to them. Grilling David a bit, I hope, about his book, Eyes and Ears. It's a good read, and I'm hand you over to them now. God bless you. Bye-bye.
Next month, a book which I have written called Eyes and Ears, A Survivor's Guide to Westminster, will be published, part of which covers Brexit. And yes, by inference, everyone will be in the book. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that the last general election was not fought on how political parties might handle the coronavirus pandemic, but was categorically about ensuring that the result of the 2016 referendum was implemented in full? Will my right honourable friend confirm that that is what he intends to see happen?
Prime Minister. I can indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I congratulate my right honourable friend on his new book.
And if you were to read his excellent book, Madam Deputy Speaker, Eyes and Ears, probably available in all good bookshops, you would be aware that he is the proud patron of the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation and has devoted much of his life to campaigning on behalf of our furry friends.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event. Thank you for joining. If at the end of my being interviewed you would like to ask me any questions, please put those questions in the live chat section. And if you would like to purchase the book, There is a link that you can find below, so please go to that. You can get the book from Ian Dale at Politicos, you can get it from Amazon, you can also get it direct from Lueth, the publishers. But finally, you could also get it directly from myself. I've got a number of my books in the House of Commons, and through your own Member of Parliament, if you tell them that you would like the book, I'm sure they'd be only too pleased to collect them directly from my office in the House of Commons. I hope you enjoy the evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And tonight, I'm delighted to say that together with my two friends and colleagues, Anne Widdicombe and David Alton, we're going to be joined by primarily a Catholic audience. And I hope that people are impressed. I'm wearing a papal tie. And the whole idea of this evening, which I really do hope you'll enjoy, is to promote this book that I've written. I mean, some people might have thought that I wasn't even capable of writing a book, but I didn't have a ghost writer. It's all my own work. And it's called Eyes and Ears, A Survivor's Guide to Westminster. The reason it's called Eyes and Ears is obviously voting aye, voting no, and ears is listening to people. And Survivor's Guide to Westminster, it's because the average term of a Member of Parliament is about 8 years. And to have done now, getting on for 40 years is quite unusual. And out of the House of Commons, 650 members of Parliament, I'm now the 7th longest serving member, which I certainly hadn't expected to be going back to 1983. So look, less of me. Now I'm going to hand over to Anne and David to quiz me on anything and everything. It can be about the book or it could be about issues generally. Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll go first because it's always ladies first in old-fashioned times. So, David, you're the 7th longest serving member. Have you any ambitions to be father of the house?
Look, Anne, you're godmother to one of my own children. I'm a father to 5 children. Do I want 649 people to be father to? I don't know. Look, Anne, yes, I would. And I tell you why. You're the first to be called in debates, and I wouldn't be tail end Charlie anymore. So that would be great. And it also would be rather wonderful at the state opening of Parliament to start off proceedings. But look, my life, like everyone's life, is full of twists and turns, and you just can't plan these things. I never thought I would still be here now. So if it happens, I'd be delighted. But if it doesn't happen, you won't actually know that I'm furious. I pretend that it's okay. But yes, Anne, I would like to be father of the house.
David, let's take you back, if we may, to your origins, the beginnings. We have something in common, of course, which is that we were both baptized in the same East End of London church in St Anthony's at Forest Gate. And although I migrated north later on as a student to Liverpool, you migrated out to Essex and became a Member of Parliament in Basildon. But tell us about your beginnings and the effect that your faith had on you in those early years.
Well, David, you're right to talk about St Anthony's Church, which I still occasionally visit these days. It looks the same from the outside, but it's changed really in its setting. But my goodness, I spent so many happy times in St Anthony's Church as an altar server, Boy Scout, going to St Anthony's Infant and Junior School and St Bonaventure's. But David, I'm very proud of my upbringing. And yes, I was born a Catholic, I'll die Catholic. And I'm not going to change faith now. And it won't be until I'm dead whether I'm going to find out whether I followed the right course. But yeah, my Catholic faith, it's in my DNA, frankly. And there I was, Father Andrew, you remember Father Andrew, a saint, teaching me to serve on the altar. Although Anne, of course, would be horrified because she's very good at the classics. But when I took O-level Latin, I got the lowest grade possible, which was But I know, there we go. But I learnt the Latin Mass off by heart, and my mother used to walk me every day to and fro to St Anthony's Church, and it was very, very important to me. And David, okay, you moved on to posh areas, but I was born into poverty. We didn't have a bathroom. There was a tin bath hanging on the wall outside. We didn't have a refrigerator. We had a larder where the food could be kept cold. We didn't have a car. We used our legs to walk everywhere. And we certainly didn't have a telephone. We just threw the windows open and screamed loudly everywhere. But look, I'm probably boring everyone living in the past, but I am a Catholic and I'm proud to be so, David.
The funny thing is, David, that of course our roots really are exactly the same, because we lived in 2 rooms, we had no bath and all those things, and we were rehoused from beyond that neighbourhood right out to a council estate on the edge of London. But you mentioned Father Andrew, and many years ago I gave out the prizes at St Bonaventure's, the school you went to, and afterwards they said to me, would I like to see the church? So in we went into St Anthony's, and they had got out the baptismal register, and I said, oh, whatever happened to Father Andrew, who was the priest who baptized me, the Franciscan who baptized me? And the elderly man standing there said, that's me. Which was amazing, really. I mean, no one had said anything until that moment. If I hadn't asked the question, I probably would never have been told the answer. So yeah, there are always bad things, aren't there, that can happen, but we should always remember the good things as well. And clearly your faith has had a huge impact on you. And your mother, of course, stayed and lived in the parish, didn't she, all her life?
She did. She was a devout Catholic, and she and Father Andrew knew each other well. He had a sister, I don't know if you recall, she became a nun at St Angela's Convent. And because Father Andrew, I don't mean this unkindly, but he was fairly fussy about things. So the habit that he wore had to be a precise length. And my mother, being a court dressmaker, was given the job of turning the hem up on it and making it absolutely perfect. But yeah, look, I owe Father Andrew so much. He was sort of my mentor, really, a good, kind man. And when I went to his funeral, it was not exactly the same as Pope John Paul II, but it was a rather wonderful funeral. And I can see dear Anne, my friend now, is absolutely chafing at the bit to get in, David. It's something you and I have said that has triggered a thought in her mind.
Well, no, not at all. I was just wondering if we were going to have a dialogue for the rest of the...
It'd be a brave man who tried to stop you, Anne.
Well, indeed, I already feel like the odd one out, because first of all, I wasn't born into restricted circumstances. I had a very decent, materially speaking, and every other way speaking as well, upbringing. And I certainly wasn't born a Catholic. But I do vividly remember when I decided to become a Catholic, and I told you to, yes, David, I told you to in the Pugin room, which is a sort of a watering hole in the House of Commons, and we were sitting there, and I said to you both, I've decided to become a Catholic. And your reply, David, which you clearly remember, since you're blushing very prettily, was that you did not see why the Catholic Church should be used as a dustbin for disaffected Anglicans. Can I ask you if you changed your mind?
Oh, Anna, now you've shared that secret with everyone. And who was the MP for Canterbury? Didn't he change?
Julian Brazier.
Yeah. I don't know why I said it. And look, over the years, if you could produce a book on all the undiplomatic things I said, I don't know, you must have wound me up, but look, how wrong was I? You're better Catholic than I am, frankly. You know, you could tell me when there are holy days of obligation, you could tell me about all the duties about going to the confessional, far better Catholic than I would ever been. I can't remember why I said that, Anne.
Yes, but I was actually trying to look at the rather broader point, and never mind whether, you know, I'm welcome now in your books or not, but the much broader point, which is that at that time, we, the Anglican Church, lost 348 clergy to either Rome or the Orthodox Church. It lost thousands of laity, 5 MPs, over the course of a few months joined the Roman Catholic Church. Do you think that those incoming Anglican priests were actually a great blessing at a time when our own vocations were drying up?
Oh, Anne, I personally do. In fact, I go to St Helens in Southend in Westcliff and to Our Lady of Lourdes. But I suppose the priest that I'm most friendly with is one of these Anglicans at St Peter's, and he's absolutely marvellous. And Anne, we've got a huge problem in the Catholic Church getting priests. I mean, dare I say it, David, the Irish supply is dried up. My local church is run by Filipino priests who are absolutely magnificent. But your ex-Church of England priests were an absolute lifeline, and none of them have let us down, frankly. So pleased that they came to see us. And Anne and David, I never thought I'd be saying this. I was with Anne. You didn't have female priests. I understand all of that. But now some people are saying, well, David, why can't priests be married?
What? Oh, hold on. I thought you were going to say, why can't we have women priests? I was about to leave the Zoom meeting. Yeah.
Well, before Anne has a fit of apoplexy, and we go back to your real question, which was about married priests, we do have married priests. Not only do we have many Anglicans who have become Catholics and were allowed to become priests as people who had already been married, but within the Greek Catholic tradition, which is in full communion with the Roman Catholic Church, there are married priests. And for the first centuries of the Latin Rite, our rite, the Roman Catholic Rite,
1100 years. Yeah.
For 1100 years, there were married priests. So this is, as John Paul II said, this is only a rule, and it's perfectly okay to debate it. And there has been some discussion in recent years. I think it's a change that is long overdue. I would love to see fully married clergy, and I think it was a wise thing that John Paul and then Pope Benedict did, and indeed the late Cardinal Hume, whom the three of us admired so much. Wonderful, he knew what he was doing when he said, we would like to have these married clergy in England and Wales. Why? Because it gave us a chance to see how well it works. Incidentally, we also have, of course, married deacons all over the country. And without them, many of our parishes would not have been able to cope at all with the reduction in vocations. So we have to sometimes reevaluate, but this isn't asking people to do something radical and revolutionary. It's actually taking one of our oldest traditions and building upon it and using it in these times. So
one of the things I've always found difficult, and obviously I came from an Anglican tradition. I took it utterly for granted that priests married. My brother was a vicar, my uncle was a vicar, my nephew's a vicar, all married. I just took it, totally for granted. But what a lot of people said to me when I was crossing the Tiber was, look, Anne, this is all very well, but if you are a Catholic priest and you fall in love and you want to marry, you've got a straight choice. Either you don't marry and stay a priest, or you leave the active priesthood if you want to marry. That is not a choice, of course, that faces Anglicans crossing over. And for a long time, the way the Catholic Church addressed that was to restrict crossing Anglican priests to saying, right, we've got to be chaplains, armed services, prisons, hospitals. We don't actually be in the parishes. Now they're in the parishes because of the shortage of vocations. And I don't think the distinction is going to be sustainable much longer.
I agree entirely with what Anne has just said. I also think, though, that when you look at the Orthodox tradition, where they have married priests but not married bishops, it makes the point that St. Paul made, that he said that you should be celibate, but if you can't be, then it's okay to get married. But it's got to be one thing or the other. And I think that for some people who can't be celibate, it is a shame that they are ruled out of becoming priests. So I think if we followed the Orthodox tradition, the Greek Catholic tradition of allowing married priests, but those who are called to give everything through this generous act of celibacy should continue to be our bishops. And in that way, I think we'd get a better balance.
And we do know, of course, that St. Peter had a mother-in-law, which means that he was married.
And I had a father-in-law who was a married Anglican priest. So I've looked at this close up, and I'm full of admiration for many clergy who are married and the way that they juggle all the various commitments that they have. So I don't think we should be negative about this. And whatever position people come from in terms of their sort of church political views, whether they regard themselves as more liberal or more conservative, I think there's a lot of agreement right across the church that this is a reform that is long overdue.
It is wonderful listening to you two, you know. David, the Greek Orthodox tradition I love, but I don't want our services to be quite as long as their services.
Well, I was once with a mutual friend of ours, Joanna Bogle, where we were in Russia, and we went to a Russian Orthodox service, which went on and on and on and on, and we were both standing for, I mean, it seemed like an eternity. And Joanna said in quite a loud voice, she said, "Oh, really, I do think we should have had some chairs." And a babushka, a Russian lady who had lots of wrappings and veils around her head, turned around and in perfect English said, "We would not think it fitting to sit before our God." When it did shut us up. But I do agree with you that I think that services should be kept to a certain length. Our old friend, if you remember, also a Franciscan friend to all of us, Father Michael Seed, he certainly knew the importance of brevity when it came to things like sermons. And if you go on and on and on and on, people are just going to fall asleep.
Indeed, my sister-in-law, who of course is an Anglican, she to this day, when she comes to stay with me for Easter, can't believe the length of the Easter Vigil. And she always comes out saying, "Oh, I've never spent so long in church in my life." and that's less than 3 hours.
Now, look, Anne and David, the book, you will be only too well aware that we all know what the Gang of Four were, but there was another Gang of Four, and there is one of our number missing, the late, great Ken Hargreaves. And of course, the four of us were involved in many parliamentary battles on pro-life issues. And my goodness, you two were so brave. And David, I'm not going to name names because I didn't in the book. I didn't want to make it nasty. But I, of course, remember the very personal and vitriolic attacks made against your good self. I mean, Anne, you obviously missed the likes of Phyllis Bowman and Bernard Brain. Did you feel when you left Parliament that the whole push in the pro-life movement in Parliament had changed and perhaps wasn't quite as strong as it had been?
Yes, I did. Now, there were individuals there, people like Fiona Bruce, for example, who Andrew Selous, people of that sort, who kept up the good fight. And there are people there now keeping up the good fight. But I think the big change was that whereas when we had David's bill, for example, you know, we had over 200 people voting for that bill on a Friday morning when people had other things to do. The chamber was absolutely packed. And so were the public galleries. And it was seen as a major issue.
It was.
And that continued for a while. But I think now, it's like everything, you know, the pro-abortion culture has seeped into our society. And now it's regarded as a bit of a fringe issue.
Yes, it has.
And I think that is what we have to fight. What we have to fight is public indifference. If you look at Wilberforce's fight against slavery, his really big problem was not so much the major economic interests who were opposed to him. It was just the public indifference. You know, well, who cared what was happening to people in a different part of the world? Who cared about that? They had other things to worry about, and particularly in those days, they had lots of things to worry about. And he had to get into, if you like, the nervous center of the debate. And that, I think, is where we were with the pro-life debate in the 80s and 90s, but I don't think we're there now.
There are, however, though, Anne and David, I mean, there are people who are coming up who are working incredibly hard. And the Right to Life organization, which Phyllis Bowman founded, I am full of admiration for the young people involved in that. And there's a new young MP in the House of Commons, Carla Lockhart, who's just become chair of the all-party parliamentary group. And I think Phyllis Bowman, exerting influence in high places, as I'm sure she is to this day,
I hope so.
She would be delighted that Carla has become chair of that group, and some of the other members. So I agree with you. It is disproportionate, the interest we have in fringe questions, and yet this central defining issue. I mean, one abortion takes place every 3 minutes in the United Kingdom. Yeah. Every 3 minutes. 9 million have been aborted since the law was changed in 1967. And yet you think about the things that parliamentarians go on about, and yet hardly a word is said often about these things. So it is a central and defining issue. Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that the right to life is the most fundamental of human rights. Now, all the others, 30 articles of human rights, are worthless if you can't be born in the first place. So we've got to challenge this idea that it's just your right to choose. But I am encouraged from time to time. I mean, Anne, you and I and David worked together on my bill, but we changed minds in the course of it. Well, you'll remember the story of the Oxford student.
Yes.
He was a young man who went to court to challenge the decision of his girlfriend to go ahead with an abortion. She said it was going to ruin her life to have this baby. And he was told by the judge, you have no say in this, you're only the father. And so a decision was taken for the abortion to go ahead. But what isn't in the textbooks that describe that case is that afterwards, the young woman came to see him and said, look, I don't love you, I'm not going to marry you, but if you're willing to bring up this child, then I'm willing to have the child. She did go ahead and do that because he was willing to stand in the breach. And you know what? A while ago, I was speaking at Durham University. I was asked a question by a student, well, what can we personally do? I told the story of the Oxford student. And afterwards, a man came up to me, and he's an academic at Durham, and he said, I'd just like you to know, I'm the Oxford student, and my daughter has just started at university. The Jewish rabbi who said the person who saves a single life saves the world. So what you've done, what David's done, and our wonderful late friend Ken Hargreaves, and all those in the pro-life movement, they must keep that in mind, that you save lives, you speak out when you can. And yes, Wilberforce, it took him 40 years to change the laws. 40 years. So I think that those who the baton is passing on to, they will carry on with this. And one day people will look back and say, why was it that they allowed these things to happen? I've just greeted into the world. I've just held him for the first time, my new grandson, who was born on St. Patrick's Day. And you look, and I've seen him and my other grandchildren, my own children on the scan. When you look at these new human beings, how can we treat them in the way that we do? And why are people so silent?
Well, David, I haven't got any grandchildren yet, but I'm rather looking forward to it because you can give them back sometime. But look,
I think I'd like to pick up on something that David said there, where you said, David, that David Alton, that is, that you know, one step at a time, each individual life. You tell the story of the Oxford student. I'm very envious that you've met the Oxford student. But I recently, a few months ago, saw a film which you've probably already seen called Hacksaw Ridge.
Yes, I have.
And you have, yeah. Now, the crucial thing there is you have, yes, it's a wonderfully faith-affirming film. You have a man who was a Seventh-day Adventist, conscientious objector, wouldn't carry arms, but did want to be a medic in action, and he was, to cut a long story short. And he saved, from one single battle, Hacksaw Ridge, he saved 75 wounded men. But what did he pray? He didn't say, oh Lord, let me save all who are wounded here. He said, just one more, Lord. And when he got that one over the ridge, he said, just one more, Lord. And he kept going 75 times praying, just one more. And sometimes I think, you know, we make it all encompassing. Oh God, please abolish abortion. Well, how about just one mind change today?
Very good point. Absolutely right.
David and Anne, I've decided I'm going to interview both of you. Now, could you just reflect on this? David, you've really surprised me about Carla Lockhart. I don't know her that well. Well, when did she become chairman?
Just about a month ago. I first met Carla when she was a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly. Pardon?
What happened to the Labour chap who was the chairman?
Well, no, Fiona Bruce was the chairman previously.
Right, okay.
But
so Carla's now taken over the whole thing.
yes.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Look, David, you observe from a distance what's going on in the Commons, but obviously you are disconnected because there's been a huge turnover, and you know, there are 104 new Conservative colleagues elected on the 12th of December 2019, so I'm only just beginning to learn about them. But my goodness, Anne and David, things have changed. And what I don't understand, could you please help me with this? When the three of us were first elected, there weren't many female members of parliament.
Yeah.
Now there are a huge number of female members of parliament. The next big change, for a female member of parliament to have a baby, it was completely unheard of. Now every day, every week, there's a colleague having a baby, because I can see it all on the WhatsApp groups on this. So as David, you spoke about your grandchild and all of that. What I don't understand, and we've seen recently how they've tried to hijack things going on in Northern Ireland, with them having these babies, putting the argument aside, why is it that they can't deal with the question of viability? You know, babies can live at 22, 23, 24 weeks. So given that Anne said earlier, you know, we're now even frightened to say something because we can make the situation even worse. Well, what's happened in society that we have now female members of parliament having babies that they obviously don't feel quite as strongly as the three of us do on this issue?
Right, well, you know, you can go first if you want to, David.
No, I'm happy to go after you.
I just don't understand it. I'm sorry.
I think that the situation was best summed up when we were doing a study in the Health Select Committee, and Nick Winterton and I were taking a particular line when we did an inquiry into the workings of the Conscience Clause of the 1967 Act. And there was one piece of evidence given there which really, really struck me. And I think it explains much of what has followed. A gynecologist who'd been away from the NHS where she had qualified, she'd been away in Australia for 10 years and she'd come back with her family to practice again in this country. And she said, when she left, you had to explain and justify yourself if you wanted to carry out an abortion. When she came back 10 years later, you had to explain and justify yourself if you would not carry out an abortion. In other words, the entire culture changed. And I think that is where we are now. We're in a culture which is totally acceptant of abortion, which believes somehow it's a woman's right, despite the fact 50% of those aborted are actually girls. It's a woman's right. And that is now the psyche. And therefore, when a woman has a baby, and don't forget, some women have babies after having had abortions. Yeah. And sometimes they have babies and go on later to have abortions. They don't actually connect the child they're holding with another child in the womb.
Yeah,
they don't connect.
It is extraordinary that we don't make that connection. I think, David, you're right, though, to raise this issue of conscience and the issue of viability. Taking viability first, one of the issues that the three of us raised when I promoted my own private member's bill was that it was outrageous that babies that could be born alive were being aborted. And that still remains the case, although we did see a small reduction in the upper time limit. However, we also saw an extension of the time limit in the case of disability. So a baby with cleft palate, which we said would happen, a baby with club foot, hair lip, Down syndrome, 90% of all babies with Down syndrome are now aborted. And I was recently sent a wonderful snippet from the internet of a young man who has Down syndrome and is part of a theatre company called the Blue Apple Theatre Company in Winchester. And he was just simply saying, to be or not to be, that is the question. And of course, that is the question for people with Down syndrome or people with disabilities. So Tommy touched my heart, and I think somehow we have to make, as Anne is saying, really, we have to somehow connect people to the humanity of and the sanctity of human life and the inhumanity of what it is that we then allow. And so on the question of conscience, as a young schoolboy, I collected petitions against the Abortion Act, which was going through Parliament at that time. Only 29 MPs actually voted against it, of course, at that time, which is extraordinary when you think back.
Yeah.
However, it was a conscience issue. When I joined a political party, it was a conscience question. That party went on, as you know, to make it a matter of policy. And I think we've seen that across so many aspects of life. Anne has talked about the medical profession and how that has been changed, and people have been corralled that if you're not prepared to do these things, there'll be no progress for you. So the closing down of conscience, we're seeing it now on a whole variety of gender issues as well. But if you dare to step out of line, J.K. Rowling or Germaine Greer, it's slightly ironic that people who were so vociferous in opposing so much of what we stood for, even great universities like Oxford University, closing down debate, no platforming people, not allowing them to express their view. For me, this is illiberalism, intolerance, and it is one of the worst things that is affecting society at the moment. And it may be that because now people who themselves have been very anti our positions on the life questions, because they are now on the receiving end of this curtailment of free speech, maybe we'll see a backlash. I certainly hope so. And David, what about you? No one's succeeded in shutting you up over the years. I mean, have you suffered at all in your constituency association with constituents because of being so strong on this? No.
I haven't. And David and Anne, do you recall the campaign we had, which was very, very controversial, when the aborted fetus arrived, being sent to all MPs? Model. They opened the package, and the model showed what an aborted baby would look like. And there was a terrible outcry about it, but I think we decided with the best of intentions to bring home to people that is what an aborted child would look like. No, David, I haven't had any adverse reaction locally, but you see, we just don't talk about it anymore. The white flower campaigns aren't as they used to be. So I don't know where we're going on this issue, but I do think it's strange. Female members of Parliament, they bring their babies into Parliament now. We see them all the time. You'd think that they would say, oh, look, at 23 weeks, we can save these babies. The issue that seems to be slightly stronger is about euthanasia. We seem to have much more traction on people thinking, oh, look, it isn't a good idea to euthanize people. Do you see any change, both of you, on this particular?
I think there's a very obvious difference. We're not going to be aborted, but we are going to grow old, and we may be demented, and we may have decisions taken out of our hands, and we tend to be quite careful, therefore, about what we wish for. And I think that does play a part in it. But I think that in the main, people can focus when it's a human being who's living and walking among us. We empathize with that human being. But whereas you and I and an awful lot of other people also empathize with the human being that we cannot see, the one that's in the womb, that empathy is somehow attenuated. And I've said for years, and I think I've heard David say the same thing, that if when women were going into the abortion clinics, people could actually see the unborn children that they were taking for destruction, there'd be an uprising. But because you don't see it, it's out of sight, out of mind.
Yes, that's right. I mean, and they can't come as witnesses. They can't come to lobby Parliament. They're not able to speak in the same way that, for instance, disabled people were able to come and lobby against attempts to legalize euthanasia. I mean, they held banners saying, "We're not dead yet." People were shocked. They confronted MPs and said, "You're talking about people like me when you're saying that my life isn't worth living." And the so-called slippery slope arguments, which we've seen certainly with abortion, because in 1967, when the law was changed, it was only ever supposed to be in very extreme circumstances with all the justifications referred to. And we know where that's led, as I said, to one abortion every 3 minutes. And people can now look at Holland, they can look at Belgium, the state of Oregon, and they can see what has happened when the law has been changed. But you start by saying, oh, well, it's just someone who is in great pain or suffering and dying anyway. And that moves on to people who do have dementia, or who are just depressed, or who say my life isn't worth living. And rather than dealing with the root cause, they say, oh, well, fair enough, we'll give you a lethal injection. Well, I don't want to live in that kind of society. And I think that there is a backlash. It's interesting for me that many members, certainly of the House of Lords, and the same is true in the Commons, who would not be with us on the beginning of life issues, have voted with us together on the end of life issues. And I saw that, again, only a week ago, Danny Kruger, the Conservative MP, has just set up a new all-party group, a Living and Dying Well all-party group, in order to fight against the legalization of so-called assisted dying.
Well, I mean, sorry, yeah, I think that David Alton, that is, you know well, that I've always held the position that if somebody is terminally and painfully ill and wants to end it, that I would not have, and I know the Catholic Church teaches otherwise, but I would not have a moral objection. But I don't believe for one single millisecond that you could contain that provision to those very restricted circumstances. I know that it would become a runaway bus in record time, probably. I mean, you take the obvious situation, you've got two people side by side in hospital, both are terminally ill, both are painfully ill. The one has mental capacity to say, I want to end it, and the other doesn't. How long do you think it would be before the state decided that it was okay for relatives and doctors to take the decision for the other person? Then you've moved from voluntary to involuntary euthanasia in one bound. And you just look at Holland. Just look at Holland.
Exactly, and you don't need to have a doctor give you a lethal injection to die with dignity. Good palliative care, the hospice movement, is the alternative, and that's what we've got to fight for. It isn't just about slippery slopes, though. It's also about the doctors themselves. The reason why the British Medical Association and the Royal Colleges have been so strongly opposed to changing the law is because you would require a doctor to do the deed. And so the defender of life then becomes the destroyer of life. I wouldn't want my doctor to be the person who gave me a lethal injection. So the safety arguments, the vulnerability of disabled people, and all the points that Anne has just made about the runaway coach, before we go headlong into changing the law in the UK, we ought to say, actually, we have a good law. We have a very good law. It requires us to be compassionate. It requires us to care. It requires us to defend life. We don't have to go to heroic lengths to keep someone alive who would otherwise die. So I think we've got a good law, and we should insist that we keep it this way.
Anne and David, I agree with you both. Long may we continue to fight the good fight. And look at that doctor who was found to have murdered over 300 people. That should never, never be forgotten. Look, before we end our programme this evening, I just wanted to touch on 3 further subjects quickly. And it's because I do mention it in the book, and it's about the change in the sort of person who becomes a member of Parliament. I'm not thinking of the House of Lords so much. And I did tell all my colleagues that they're all in the book when I talk about types of MPs. Now, it is difficult because I'm only halfway through my career, and there will be a sequel to this book, but that will have to be after I've left the place, because I haven't got the money at the moment to employ Carter Rupp with all the people who will sue me if I'm straight talking. But Anne and David, you both noticed changes in the sort of person who became a member of Parliament today, and I don't mean this in a bad sense.
Oh, I do.
Oh, okay, go on then, Anne.
Yes, I think there's a massive change, and not for the better, in the quality of the Member of Parliament. Now, you've got a section in your book which more or less ascribes this to career politicians, but I think it's far, far deeper than that. And I believe that the rot started when both major parties started to go down the road of quotas, all women shortlists, specifying the sort of person they wanted to be an MP rather than merit. So it was more important what your gender, your ethnicity, your sexuality, or whatever it might be, was than merit as an MP. And when the central parties started to interrupt what local parties were doing, who were making choices as they thought were appropriate for their area, and started imposing their A-lists and their all-women shortlists and all the rest of it, what they were effectively doing was saying was merit is no longer the determining factor. And this was really brought home to me during the selection for my successor, who happened to be a woman. But when we got to the point of the final shortlist, we wanted to have 3 men on it. And we were told, no, if you're having a shortlist of 4, it's got to be 2 men and 2 women. And one of our members actually said to the central office agent who was there supervising the selection process, said, well, hang on, are you telling us we can't be governed by merit? And the central office agent said very truthfully, yes, those are the rules. You have to have an equal number of the sexes, never mind merit. Now, as it happened, you know, a woman got it. So in that occasion, you know, you could say the merit decision was taken. But it meant that we had to exclude men and bring other women up to the shortlist because that was what the party wanted. It was too concerned about the composition of Parliament. Now, Parliament used to be decided solely on merit, as determined by the local constituency association, who might get it right or who might get it hopelessly wrong. But it was done on merit. And the day and the hour that Parliament became more, or the leaders of the main parties became more concerned about the appearance of their benches than the substance of their benches, was when the rot set in. And I mean, you and I can remember, I mean, in my intake, we had on the Labour side, we had a brain surgeon. On our side, we had a consultant gynecologist. We took it utterly for granted that we recruited at that level.
Yeah.
And that's gone.
Yeah. David, do you agree?
Yes, of course I do, David. I think that merit should be the key factor, but also connectedness as well to communities. I think we've got far too many people whose only real experience has been being a research assistant to someone in the Westminster bubble, and they talk to one another rather than talking to the people outside. It was G.K. Chesterton who talked about the secret people. We are the people of England and we have not spoken yet. Smile at us, pay us and pass us, but do not quite forget. Well, we do forget about ordinary folk, and people send out their tweets and all the rest of it, but they should go and talk to people on the streets, and they should stay connected. They should also have a little less political correctness. We need a different kind of PC, and that's political courage. People need to use Parliament as a place to speak and and to champion causes, even when it makes you unpopular.
As you are now, David. Rejoin. You're being brave.
I've just been sanctioned by the People's Republic of China. Yes, it's at this point in my life, it's quite a distinction. It's caused great amusement amongst my friends and family. But but setting that to one side, David, I regard it as an extraordinary privilege to have been able to make a coalition with people like Sir Ian Duncan Smith, and across both houses of Parliament, for us to be able to speak up for the people of Hong Kong, whose democratic rights are being taken away, to speak up for Uyghurs, who are the subject of genocide. That's why I went into Parliament, I wouldn't have joined a political party with 6 MPs and 4% in the opinion polls if I wanted a career, David. I was elected by people who were good enough to send me back again as they've sent you back again over the years. They didn't want someone who always voted at their party's call and never ever thinks of themselves at all. And I was especially pleased, David, when I saw that you voted for the genocide amendment that we sent down to the Commons from the House of Lords, because you think for yourself, and that's how it should be. And that's why the three of us, I think, get on so famously.
And David, that leads neatly onto the second of the 3 final issues. And that's really about big political figures that the 3 of us have worked with. Now, Anne, I have a vision of you and I sitting in a room trying to fight to save Margaret Thatcher as our leader and prime minister with our little bits of paper at the 11th hour. I mean, we could, the viewers would, I think, love to listen to all these little asides, but unfortunately, we don't have the time tonight. Now, look, for me, unashamedly, of all the prime ministers that I served with in Parliament, it would have been Margaret Thatcher. She was the person who drove me politically. I thought she was absolutely incredible. But I know there are so many others, perhaps very humble, very quietly getting on with their jobs. The three of us were in Parliament during some extraordinary times when the chambers full and the power of oratory actually made a difference.
Yeah.
Whereas now, of course, the place is empty. I mean, it's not their fault, but I'm even making speeches via Zoom and all of that. So who do you both think were the great parliamentarians in your time who really made a difference?
Just let me say, I think what killed the chamber was the advent of television, which I voted in favour of. I mean, I was in favour of televising.
I voted against, Dan.
Oh, yeah, well done. But of course, what it meant was that you didn't actually have to go into the chamber anymore. You sat in your office watching the live feed. And when you and I were in there before the days of televising, the way you knew whether somebody was on the up or not was whether people rushed into the chamber when they were about to speak, or whether people left the chamber as they stood up to speak. And the chamber was important, and oratory was important.
It was.
And you didn't have to be, particularly conventional. Ian Paisley. People used to go in to hear Ian Paisley just because he was such a thumping good orator. And people used to hear Michael Heseltine for the same reason. The Labour people would go in to hear Heseltine.
Absolutely.
And we had, the chamber was important. It isn't now. It isn't now. And I think that's been the downside. As I say, I voted for television, but I think that's been the downside of televising the chamber. But we had big people. I mean, we had people like, you and I wouldn't agree with them on Europe, but people like Ken Clarke, who were figures who actually, when they were running a department, they imposed new ideas. They carried it through. They weren't just run by the civil servants. And we had those people, and they were big people. I look round now, you ask me who they are. Well, I don't know. Tell me sometime.
David, what's your perception?
Well, I agree with Anne, but I have to put my hand up and say I was one of the 6 MPs who put down the motion calling for the televising of Parliament. And I still think it was the right thing for us to do, because it gives people access to our debates, especially our committees and things that they would never get to see otherwise. But setting that to one side, I think it's the kind of people coming into Parliament that has changed it rather more than televising it. And I think back to my first Parliament, Margaret Thatcher. Well, in fact, I was elected, of course, the day after Margaret Thatcher won the vote of no confidence. So the general election was called on a Wednesday night. I was elected the next day and made my maiden speech within 2 hours of arriving, because Parliament was being wound up for the general election. But I came back then, happily, and Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. And she was a remarkable woman. And there were people, you take people like Michael Foot on the Labour benches, when there was a debate in the House about, for instance, the economic issues at that time, unemployment. These were extraordinary debates.
Reggie Ben.
And Tony Benn, always. You didn't have to agree with him, or for that matter, Enoch Powell, but you would always want to listen. And there is a difference that people like Enoch Powell, people like Joe Grimmond, people like Dennis Healey, they had something in common, which is that they had served in the Second World War. And I suppose all of us I had an uncle who was killed in the RAF. My father was a desert rat. You knew that when they talked about war and peace issues, when we took the decision to send the task force to the Falklands, they knew that people would die, and they knew what that meant in a way that sometimes I think that it's almost as though the only thought that people have about our servicemen is bound up with the computer games that people play, rather than about the flesh and blood lives that are on the line. But my first time that I ever came to Parliament was as a boy. Our school was brought in 1965, and we walked past the coffin in Westminster Hall of Sir Winston Churchill. And of course, he was the greatest of our wartime prime ministers. I would argue that Gladstone whose plaque is alongside his in Westminster Hall, There was another of our great prime ministers, 4 times born in the city of Liverpool. And these were remarkable figures. And we should cherish the remarkable people, and we should uphold them. And we shouldn't be pulling down statues, and we all this crazy nonsense of not explaining the differences between now and then and what the circumstances were. I mean, for goodness sake, we should be extolling the virtues of people and saying, yes, people make mistakes, but David, as you and I know, the man who never made a mistake never made anything. We make mistakes, and in our different generations, different things are done that we would now regret. But for goodness sake, extol the virtues, the extraordinary people, the wonderful things, the liberties that the 3 of us enjoy, thanks to the sacrifices others have made.
And that is why, David, we're going to have a memorial to the late, great Dame Vera Lynn on the White Cliff.
And thank you for all you've done about Vera Lynn. I mean, over the years, I mean, I, like you, have a love of her, not least because of my father, who loved Dame Vera, and what an extraordinary woman. So yeah, you've done a brilliant job on making sure we remember who she is.
Yeah, bless you. So Anna, David, it's now the last topic I just wanted to touch on briefly, and that's about the place itself. Because look, I unashamedly love the Palace of Westminster and the Commons. And when it was first mooted that we were going to move out for 10 years, I was absolutely horrified. David, I'm not having a go at you. I think there are too many people in the House of Lords.
I agree.
Here.
But Anne,
I wish Anne was there.
Anne should be there with you, but I think there are too many. But the idea that we leave the building for 10 years, and I felt very strongly we may never go back. And there are umpteen people who don't think we should stick with our traditions, walking through the lobbies, voting the way we do. They don't want us to sit on the green benches anymore. They want us all to have our own desks like Anne, poor thing, had in the European Parliament and all of that. Now, am I a dinosaur in resisting all this? You tell me, is it, am I wrong not to embrace changes and the fact that I want to stay as our place of work in the Palace of Westminster? Please tell me.
Well, if you were resisting change for change's sake, then, I would say you're wrong. But I think there are very solid reasons for keeping what we've got. Let's take just one example from what you've said. You've mentioned the way that we vote. And of course, the way MPs vote is to go through lobbies physically. Yeah. Now, the big plus of that is that it's the one time of day when all your party's together and you can buttonhole a minister. Yeah. But if you have remote voting or just pressing buttons at a desk, the minister can stay quite safely ensconced in his ministerial office, and you won't actually get to buttonhole him. And people don't always understand that, something may look quaint and old-fashioned, but it also serves a massive purpose. And I'm with you. Now, obviously, Parliament does have to be a half rebuilt from inside. I mean, all 3 of us know what it's like in the summer recess. If you go into Parliament in the summer recess, you're jumping over floorboards that are up. There are wires hanging out of all the walls. I mean, it's complete chaos because they're making do and mending every summer recess. And then somehow we struggle along until the next summer recess. So we do need a thorough overhaul. And that does mean we're going to have to vacate Parliament. But I don't think that we have to vacate it en bloc. I think we should do exactly what we did in the war when the House of Commons was bombed. The House of Commons should move up to the Lords. The Lords should go off to, say, the QE2 building. And then when it's the Lords' turn to be done, we go back into the Commons. Yes. And the Lords eventually come back into their redone chamber as well. Why not?
Well, Anne will be very happy to know that is precisely what I have advocated.
Hooray!
I think this whole thing is crazy and at vast, vast expense. First of all, David, yes, the House of Lords is too big. It should never be bigger in number than the House of Commons. And that should be, I think, the yardstick. And the way to resolve this is that each of the groups, the crossbenchers and the political parties, to elect those who will stay. We should reduce the number. They will know, just as happened with the hereditary peers, they'll know the ones who work hard and they'll know the ones who don't. And they will elect them from within, let them act like colleges within the House. to reduce the number, but you'll need new blood. And it's a matter of great regret to me that Anne is not a member of the Lord. She should be there.
Yeah.
And she knows, that I have not only advocated that, I have bent people's ears on the subject over the distance, because whether I always agree with Anne is neither here nor there. This is a voice that should be heard in our parliament.
Yeah.
And so for me, hearing the voices is more important than the actual detail of what we do about restoration. But I do think that the right way to do it is, as happened in the Second World War, and that is to start at our end of the building by moving us out for the time being. The QE2 centre would be perfectly reasonable, and let the Commons move there while the work is done at the other end. Let me say one other thing though, David. I recently, because of the amendment I've been moving on genocide, I've been following the House of Commons debates. I think the truncating of debating time is outrageous. To tell people that they've got to talk about huge issues in the course of 1 or 2 minutes is an insult. To allow any government to have decided that, when it's Parliament that should decide such things. But I think Parliament has got to reassert itself in that way. And secondly, maybe here I am sounding like a real old fogey, but I'm quite shocked to hear the occupant of the chair calling members and calling them simply by their first name.
Oh, yeah.
In my time, you were the member for Southend, and Anne was the member for Maidstone. And what was the virtue of that? It's a bit like physically rubbing shoulders in division lobbies, which I agree with Anne about entirely. But the virtue of naming people by their constituencies was you then had to remember where they represented and the kind of folk that they represented. And that helped to give you some idea of why maybe they were expressing the views that they were expressing. I just think that this chumminess, it's a bit like going into the National Health Service, which we all love and are so grateful for, but it's very strange to just be addressed by your first name and to be asked questions like, do you have a partner? Well, when my wife was asked that question when she was going in to have our last child, she said no. They looked fairly shocked when they saw me with her, and she did turn and say, I have a husband. There are certain things that I think we should insist about, and I think that we can use language in ways that may sound as though you're trying to be friendly and so on, but actually, when you're in Parliament, especially, you're dealing with someone who's representing people and been elected to that post in the House of Commons by constituents and for a particular community. And those things should be referenced. And if they've been made members of the Privy Council, then they are right honourable and should be said so. If they're people who have served in the armed forces, then they are gallant and it should be said so. If they've been distinguished lawyers, then they're learned and it should be said so. So I don't think there's anything being old fogyish about this. If some things, if they just get in the way of democracy, well, reform them, that's fair enough. But other things are part of the granular nature of our democracy. And I think it's, you throw the baby out with the bathwater if you're not careful. We've been talking a lot about your book. Another book came to my mind as you were talking about it, and that's a book by E.M. Forster. It's called 2 Cheers for Democracy. He didn't give it quite 3 cheers, 2 cheers for democracy. And he described the perfect member of Parliament. And for him, he said it was the curmudgeonly, awkward, difficult, bloody-minded so-and-so who sometimes got some minor injustice put right. And I think that's probably the highest ambition that the three of us could ever possibly have.
Well, look, David, I've so enjoyed spending time with you this evening, and I'm sure the viewers have. And David and Anne, you see, we've spoken about the good times that we shared together. And I say a survivor's guide to Westminster. Well, the reason I haven't gone off yet voluntarily is because there are very few of us left who had these wonderful experiences and understand about tradition. And I'm determined that my voice will still be heard, because with the huge turnover, they only know the rubbish that frankly it has become now. Now, look, the book, any royalties go to 3 charities. And David, as a couple of chaps, did you and I know what endometriosis was?
No, I could hardly even say it, David. And that, and also prostate cancer and the other things that you're committed to. over the years, one of the things that I've most liked about you, David, is that always there will be a charity that you're pushing and raising money for. And what a good deed this is in a rather nasty world. So I hope a lot of people buy the book, not just because it's a good book, because it's also supporting good causes.
Bless you. Well, of course, Anne didn't only have responsibility in the Home Office, she had responsibility in health. I remember, my dear, the time that we spent in committee on so many bills. So endometriosis, a local constituent who suffered from it, I'm supporting her charity. And Anne, as you know, we men aren't quite as good as you ladies for looking out for ourselves. So a local constituent was suffering from prostate cancer, and through gene therapy, he became well again. So I'm supporting that. And the three of us have many constituents who had learning difficulties. I mean, Anne and David, when I was first elected, I'll never forget going to a centre in South Hockenden and seeing people in straitjackets. These people now, through a wonderful chap called David Stanley, and through the power of music, has transformed their lives. So we've not only had a concert at the London Palladium, we've not only had a concert at the Royal Albert Hall, but we're actually going on to Broadway. And if it hadn't been for the pandemic, we'd have already been there. And we're going on to Carnegie Hall. So I thank both of you. I don't know if either of you wanted to say anything in conclusion.
No, just well done. I echo what David said about, charitable causes. Most people, when they write their semi-autobiographies, which is what that is, they take the money.
And I'm just looking forward to the sequel.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've had a fabulous evening spending it with two fine friends who the three of us share the same values. We've spent so many wonderful times together in Parliament, and it's not over yet. There's more to come, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see, Anne and David are still firing on all cylinders, as am I as well. So please go out and buy this book, Eyes and Ears, A Survivor's Guide to Westminster. Good night, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
This is my journey so far, where I was born, where I became a councillor, when I was first elected to Parliament, and where I am now the Member of Parliament for. Enjoy my journey. I hope you enjoy reading my book, Eyes and Ears, A Survivor's Guide to Westminster.